And if we follow it back, it has fibers from here. And if we follow these back, it has fibers from here. And so the median nerve can contain neurons from all of these different levels.
What is the plexus?
The plexus is this whole interarrangement and interweaving of neurons from different levels of the spinal cord. Yes. So if you were at an upper division medical school or upper division college level anatomy class, you would need to be able to diagram this out and know what spinal nerves were part of the anterior trunk or the middle trunk, anterior division, posterior division, and certainly the long thoracic nerve would contain nerve fibers from C5, C6, C7, and so on. And then it becomes a puzzle. I mean, we're not going to do it to that level, but you could say, all right, if this person got in their motorcycle, got thrown against a tree, and hit their neck, and it stretched out, and we tore the spinal roots completely for C6 and C7 and C8, what nerves would lose some motor function, and what muscles would lose innervation or become weaker because they didn't have those neurons. Okay? So it becomes quite elaborate as we do that. And this is what I covered in the upper division anatomy course with cadavers at Sac State. And you start looking at then the different degrees of innervation, but that's a plexus. Okay? And we see a similar, we have a lumbar plexus for the anterior leg and a sacral plexus for the posterior thigh and leg. So we have those. I just want right now to understand that concept, and then we'll look at each individual plexus. You won't be required to know the spinal nerves for each of the nerves, but the concept of what the plexus and how the organization is occurring. So you have those lecture notes bundled together. So we're going to skip brachial plexus and so on. But I do want to talk about cervical plexus because that has to do with the neck region. Just a little, again, just a brief illustration. We'll come back and talk about it more tomorrow. So the reason I took you to brachial is this just looks very complicated. This is just a bunch of yellow lines coming out. All right? But I told you about phrenic nerve. And so here is the phrenic nerve right here. And it's getting components from C5, from C4, and from C3, even though it's going all the way down to the diaphragm. So if you recognize, even though the diaphragm is way down here, if you damage the spinal cord way up here, let's say you have a transection of the spinal cord at C2, that person's not going to be able to breathe on their own. Okay? There was an accident about 4 or 5 years ago. A young woman, I think in the El Dorado Hills area, it was her birthday, 16th, 17th birthday, and she went out to ride her horse early in the morning, and she was wearing a helmet, but she got thrown from her horse and broke her neck, and there was nobody else around, and it was a high break like this, and thoracic nerves that do the muscles between the ribs are way down here. Phrenic nerve is not getting innervation because C2 is above C3, C4, C5, and so there's no access, there's no upper motor neuron innervation of the diaphragm. This is actually what happened to Christopher Reeve. Okay, he had a C2, C3 damage to his spinal cord. He learned to control his breathing. For those of you who don't know, he played the Superman. I was trying to think of Batman movies. Superman in some of the earlier movies, and was riding the same thing. It was a horse, riding a horse. He learned when he was awake he could not breathe and talk at the same time, but he could kind of take a breath and talk in between breaths, but he couldn't fall asleep and not be on a ventilator. He had to be put back on a ventilator that would breathe for him and push the air into his lungs for him. And so that was because of the level of where that damage occurred. All right. So
does that automatically mean that like everything is paralyzed down?
yes. Now, tumors and problems can completely, you can have just the motor or sensory if it's a tumor pushing on just part on one side of the spinal cord. but if the spinal cord is transected, or if there's been sufficient damage that there's swelling, that compresses it. Now sometimes you'll have a football player that's, been damaged playing and can't move its legs on the football field, and then a week later he's starting to do that. And that's because physicians and scientists have found that a lot of that early damage is not because the spinal cord was severed, but as in any injury, there's swelling. And this is in a closed space. So just like you get a hematoma, you get loss of consciousness from the blood building up pressure because the skull's not going to expand, and the spinal cavity is not going to expand either. So they give these individuals drugs and solutions that decrease the swelling, either by removing the fluids or other mechanisms, and allow the tissue to maintain its health before it dies from compression and lack of oxygen through the blood supply, because it just can't get there due to the swelling. So it's not that they lost, nerves were cut and then they got the nerve function back. It was the initial loss was due to the swelling. Okay, muscles of the eyeball, we've talked about these already. I didn't put them on the last lab exam, but they will be on this one. So I'm not going to cover them again. And I want to move to muscles of the face. So we're going to do muscles of the face, the tongue, the chewing muscles, and the tongue today. All right? Now there are a lot of muscles of the face, and we're not doing all of them by any means. Not of the face. Oh, you mean page 70? Okay, I thought you were saying 70 muscles on the face. Well, you can't do twice. Now, some pointers on how to study this material. Okay? When I was in college, I read that you could remember more if you tried to memorize while you were walking. So I typed up lists similar to these. Oh, I have a student at Sac State today that I mentioned that in class, and she swears it works. She's been thanking me 2 or 3 times a day that it
Who wants to go on a walk tonight? Let's go.
So I would type up tables like this here, and I'd walk around. It was spring, and I'd walk miles and miles. Our dorm was in a square shape, and I'd walk around on the inside of that while it was raining. I don't want you to memorize like that. Okay, you're welcome to walk and study, but I would rather you learn associations, learn functions, learn why it's able to do something to illustrate. If my hand is a foot, and I know it's not, but it's easier to show you my hand and my foot. Here's the leg, all right? This is called the anterior compartment of the leg, and this is the posterior compartment of the leg. Anterior compartment, posterior compartment. So, when I flex my toes, you guys know what flexion means?